The morning of January 9th, 1993 was the kind of cold that doesn't just chill the skin, it gets into the bones. It gets into the thinking. The sky over Harlan County, Texas was the color of wet ash, low and heavy, pressing down on the land like a hand that refused to lift. The creek behind the Carter property had frozen at its edges overnight, and the bare cottonwood trees along the road stood perfectly still. Not because the wind had stopped, but because even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Evelyn Carter had been awake since 4 in the morning. She sat on the edge of her bed in the back room, the one with the cracked window that let in cold air no matter what she stuffed around the frame, and she stared at the floor with her hands folded in her lap and her face completely still. She was 23 years old, brown hair, rough hands, eyes that had learned, a long time ago, to show nothing. She already knew what was coming. Her father had told her 3 days ago. Not gently, not with any of the softness the moment deserved. He had looked somewhere past her left shoulder and said that arrangements had been made, that a man was coming, that it was already decided. Then he had walked back to his chair and picked up his newspaper, like he had just mentioned the weather. Evelyn had not cried. She had stopped wasting tears in that house years before. The man arrived just after 7. She heard his horse first, slow, steady hoofbeats on the frozen road, unhurried, like whoever was riding had long since made peace with the cold. Then boots on the porch steps. Then 3 knocks, patient, not loud, not demanding. Her father opened the door. Evelyn stood in the hallway and watched from the shadows. The man who had come for her was tall, broader in the shoulder than she had imagined. He wore a dark wool coat that had clearly survived many winters, and his hat was pulled low against the cold. His face was weathered and still. He didn't smile walking in. He didn't look around the room like a man surveying something he already owned. He just stood there, quietly, like a man who had seen enough of life that very little of it could rattle him anymore. Her father called her name. She walked into the room. The man looked at her, directly, but not the way she had been dreading, not hungry, not calculating. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they are genuinely trying to understand, a look that lasted only a moment before he glanced away. The paper was signed on the kitchen table, $500 counted out in neat bills and placed beside the salt shaker like it was a transaction over livestock. Her father folded the money without looking up, without pausing, without once looking at his daughter's face. Evelyn stood with her hands at her sides and her chin perfectly level. And in that silence, in the scratch of pen on paper and the soft clink of coins, she understood something that no daughter should ever have to understand. She had never been a child to him. She had only ever been a burden waiting to be transferred. His name, she learned, was Caleb Mercer. The wagon ride to his ranch took just over 3 hours. In those 3 hours, he spoke fewer than 10 words. No explanations, no promises, no attempt to fill the silence with things that would later turn out to be false. He simply drove, eyes on the road, hands steady on the reins, while the flat Texas land stretched out around them in pale gold and winter gray. Evelyn sat beside him with her small bag pressed in her lap and mentally prepared herself for every terrible thing she could imagine. She made a list in her head, the way a careful person does, the way someone does when preparation is the only armor they own. She told herself she was ready. She told herself she had survived worse. She told herself that whatever this man turned out to be, she would endure it the way she had endured everything else, quietly, without letting him see it breaking her. When they arrived at the ranch, a modest spread with a white farmhouse, a long fence line, and a barn that smelled of hay and horses and something almost like warmth, Caleb climbed down from the wagon and carried her bag inside without being asked. He showed her a room at the end of the hall, small, clean, a quilt in shades of blue and cream folded at the foot of the bed, a window that looked out over the back pasture where 2 horses stood motionless in the pale morning light. On the windowsill, someone had placed a small dried wildflower in a glass bottle, purple, long since faded, but still there, like someone had wanted the room to feel like it belonged to a person. Caleb set her bag near the door, then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small brass key on the dresser. "That locks from the inside," he said. His voice was low and measured, the voice of a man who understood the weight of words. "Your room is your room. No one comes in without your say-so. Not me, not anyone on this property." He looked at her for just a moment, and in his eyes, in the deep, settled stillness of them, she saw something she had not expected to find in the eyes of a man who had just paid money for her. She saw grief, old grief, the kind that has been carried so long it no longer makes a man angry. It only makes him careful. "There's food on the stove when you're ready," he said, and then he turned and walked back down the hallway and left her alone with the key and the faded wildflower and the silence. Evelyn did not sleep that night. She lay on top of the quilt with her boots still on and the brass key pressed hard in her palm, and she watched the ceiling for hours. Every creak of the old farmhouse made her go still. Every gust of wind against the window made her breath catch. But the door stayed closed. No footsteps came down the hall, no knock, no voice, nothing. Just the wind outside and the distant sound of one of the horses moving in the barn, and the deep, patient quiet of a house that was not asking anything of her. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, lying in the dark, with the keys still in her fist, something shifted very slightly in Evelyn Carter's chest. Not trust. She was nowhere near trust. But something smaller than trust, something cautious and half awake that had not stirred in her in a very long time. The next morning, she found coffee already made and still hot on the stove, a pair of women's work gloves on the table, soft leather, her size exactly, though she could not imagine how he had known. And on the small bedside table, placed there sometime in the night without a single sound, a book. She almost didn't pick it up. But when she saw the title on the worn cover, her breath left her body like something had reached into her chest and taken it. It was a book she had mentioned exactly once in her life, to a stranger, at a railway station years ago. Her hands were trembling when she turned it over. She set it back down on the table and stepped away from it like it had burned her. Then she picked it up again, ran her thumb along the spine, felt the soft crack of old binding. This was not a coincidence. This was not possible. And yet, here it was. Days passed, then weeks, and every single day on that ranch unsettled Evelyn in a way she could not name or resolve. Caleb taught her the horses, not with commands, but with patience. Standing beside her at the fence rail in the bitter cold, voice low, showing her how to hold her palm flat and let the animal come to her on its own time, never making her feel slow, never sighing when she pulled back out of fear. "She just needs to know you're not going to disappear on her," he said one morning, watching Evelyn stand very still while the gray mare approached. "Most creatures are like that. They don't need perfection. They just need consistency." Evelyn said nothing, but she didn't forget it. He repaired the cracked window in her room on a Tuesday while she was in the barn, said nothing about it, charged nothing for it, and she came back to find the cold draft simply gone and the room warmer, and not a word mentioned. He always made enough food for 2 without being asked. He always brought the lantern in from the barn when the wind picked up at night so she wouldn't have to walk out in the dark alone. His kindness had no performance in it, no audience, no angle. And that was the most disorienting thing Evelyn Carter had ever encountered. She had been taught by 11 years of living that softness was a trap, that gentleness lasted only until a man didn't get what he wanted. She had been shaped by proof. And here was Caleb Mercer, quiet, consistent, asking for nothing, watering all of that proof with something she had no category for. Then came the afternoon Charlotte arrived. Evelyn heard the horse from the kitchen window, a fine chestnut mare, well kept, moving fast up the road. Then her stepsister's voice calling her name from the yard, bright and warm as fresh bread. Charlotte was 4 years younger than Evelyn, beautiful in a way that was careful and deliberate. She had their father's eyes and their mother's smile, and a talent for making warmth feel like weather, present everywhere, belonging to no one in particular. She embraced Evelyn on the porch with both arms, held her a moment, stepped back, and looked at the house with an approving tilt of her head. "Well," Charlotte said, looking around the property, "he keeps a tidy place, doesn't he?" "He does," Evelyn said carefully. They talked on the porch for perhaps 20 minutes. Small things, family things. Charlotte asked questions with the lightness of someone who already knew the answers. She remarked on the horses. She touched Evelyn's arm twice in a way that felt like affection and landed like something else. Caleb came to the doorway once, nodded politely, went back inside. When Charlotte finally gathered her gloves to leave, she leaned forward and pressed her cheek lightly against Evelyn's. And in that closeness, in that whisper of breath near her ear, she said it softly, almost sweetly. "He still hasn't told you why he really wanted you here, has he?" She pulled back, smiled, mounted her horse, and rode away down the road without looking back. Evelyn stood on the porch alone. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees, and everything, the coffee, the gloves, the window, the book, the key, the gray mare, all of it began to rearrange itself in her mind into something darker and colder and far more familiar. She stood there for a long time and said nothing to anyone. For 3 days after that, she was different. She still did her work, still fed the horses, still moved through the days with the practiced stillness she had always carried, but she put distance between herself and Caleb in ways that were small enough to deny, but large enough to feel. He noticed. She could tell by the way he paused sometimes before speaking, the way he gave her more space than usual. But he didn't push, didn't demand explanation, didn't shift into something harder. He just continued, quietly, as he always had. And on the third evening, just as the sun was going down over the pasture in deep shades of amber and rose, and the air had gone perfectly still the way Texas air sometimes does right before dark, Caleb sat down on the porch steps and rested his elbows on his knees and looked out at the horizon. "I think there's something I should have told you already," he said. Evelyn stood near the porch post, arms crossed against the cold. She said nothing, but she didn't walk away. He was quiet for a long moment, like a man gathering not courage exactly, but the right order for true things. Then he began. He told her about the winter of 1882, about a railway station outside of San Marcos during a thunderstorm, about how he had not gone to that station to catch a train. He had gone there because he had spent 6 months trying to find one reason to stay in the world and finally run out of places to look. His wife had died of fever the previous spring. Her name was May. She had a laugh, he said, that you could hear from the other side of the barn. 3 months after May, his son went too. The boy was 4 years old. He had a habit of sleeping with his small fist pressed against his cheek, and Caleb had memorized that image so completely that 11 years later he could still see it without closing his eyes. He had made his decision that night. He had sat alone on a platform bench in the rain and made his peace with it. And then a girl sat down at the far end of the bench. She wasn't talking to him at first, she was just talking, the way cold and frightened people sometimes do when they need to hear a human voice, even if it's only their own. She talked about a book her mother used to read her. She talked about how people were like trees in winter, stripped all the way bare but not dead. She said that a person could be broken down to the very root and still come back in the spring. That dard hamesha nahireta, that pain was not permanent. She probably didn't know he was listening. She certainly didn't know what she was saying and to whom. "I don't think you were even talking to me," Caleb said, his voice very low now. "I heard every word." He looked down at his hands. When the train came and you picked up your bag and walked away into that crowd, I sat there in the rain for a long time, and then I stood up and I went home." He exhaled slowly. "I've thought about you since then more times than I can count. Not in a way that made sense, just the way you think about the hand that pulled you out of deep water, with gratitude you don't know what to do with." He finally looked at her. "When I heard what your father was planning, who he was planning to sell you to, I didn't think about it. I just rode." The pasture had gone dark while he spoke. The first stars were appearing above the far tree line, faint and cold and very far away. "I didn't buy you to own you," he said quietly. "I bought you because you saved my life without ever knowing it, and I wasn't going to sit by and watch someone destroy yours." Evelyn did not speak for a long time after that. She became aware slowly that her face was wet. She had not known she was crying until she reached up and felt it. She pressed her fingers to her cheek and stood very still with the cold coming up from the ground and the stars coming out overhead, and 11 years of something enormous settling around her like the first real quiet she had ever known. She had spent so long believing her words meant nothing, that she meant nothing, that she was a burden and a transaction and a problem transferred from one set of hands to another. And here was a man who had carried a 20-minute conversation with a soaking wet 17-year-old girl across 11 years of hard living, not as possession, not as obsession, but as something sacred, as proof that she had mattered, as the reason he was still standing on this earth at all. She sat down on the step beside him. Neither of them spoke. The horses moved softly in the darkened pasture. The night came fully down. The stars multiplied across the wide Texas sky until there were more of them than dark between them. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Evelyn Carter did not feel like a burden. She felt like someone who had always been, without knowing it, exactly where she was supposed to be. She never went back to her father's house. In the years that followed, the ranch grew, not into something grand or famous, but into something good. Something honest and warm and alive. She learned the land the way she learned to trust, slowly, carefully, one true day at a time. The gray mare eventually ate from her hand without hesitation. The kitchen always smelled of coffee in the mornings. The window in her room never let in the cold again. She and Caleb did not rush. Some things are too important for rushing. They build what they had the way you build anything that lasts, with patience, with steadiness, with the understanding that real love is not a single moment, but 10,000 ordinary ones chosen again and again. People in Harlan County talked, of course. People always talk. But talk is only weather. It passes. What remained, what was real, was two people who had each been broken in different ways and had found, without looking, that the pieces fit. A man who had once stood at the edge of the dark and been pulled back by the voice of a girl who never knew she was saving him. And a woman who had been handed away like she was worth nothing, and been shown in the quietest and most patient way imaginable that someone had always known she was worth everything. Neither of them had been searching, but maybe that is the way of the most important things. They do not wait for you to be ready. They find you in the cold. They find you on the bench in the rain. They find you when you have given up looking and are simply trying to survive one more night. And sometimes, if you are very fortunate, the stranger at the end of that bench is the very person who will one day hand you a key and say, without saying it, "I have not forgotten you. I carried you with me, and I always will." If this story reached something in you today, if it reminded you that the words you speak, even the quiet ones, even the ones you think no one is truly hearing, can travel farther than you will ever know, then you are exactly who Desert Heart was made for. This channel exists for the stories that don't make the headlines, the quiet sacrifices, the unspoken loyalties, The love that shows up not with grand gestures, but with a warm cup of coffee and a locked door and a book from your childhood placed on a table in the dark. If you are not yet part of this family, please subscribe to Desert Heart today. Hit the bell so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not forgotten, that they never were. Leave a comment below and tell us, has a stranger's kindness ever changed the direction of your life? We read every single one, because here at Desert Heart, every story matters, and so do you. This story carries lasting value on several levels. It reflects the true historical vulnerability of women in the 19th century America, when daughters could be legally controlled and transferred without consent, using that darkness not for shock, but to illuminate how radical simple human decency really was in that era. It teaches that words spoken without awareness of their impact can still save a life, a truth that is as relevant today as it was in 1893. It models the healing of trauma not through dramatic rescue, but through consistent, patient, respectful presence. It demonstrates the extraordinary reach of gratitude, how one act of accidental kindness can echo across a decade and return in ways we could never predict. And at its deepest level, it is a story about dignity, the quiet, unshakable belief that every human being deserves to be seen, remembered, and treated as worthy of care.